All right, let's bring in Marissa Quie. She's the Director of Studies Politics in the University of Cambridge. She's joining us from the UK. And Marissa Quie, thank you very much for being with us here on TRT World. Now, I understand you are an expert in migration, so just lay out for us, if you can, the difficulties that people face trying to leave Afghanistan at the moment.
At the moment, the situation is very difficult. Although the UN has called for safe passage, protecting people crossing borders and moving internally within the country, that has still been problematic and hasn't been guaranteed. I think a key problem is the behavior of foot soldiers on the ground who have lived lives that are shaped entirely by violence. Going forward, that will be problematic. Closed borders are also a problem. At the moment, the Chaman crossing is open between Pakistan and Afghanistan, but it's only open to people from Kandahar. And during COVID, borders were closed, and as the Taliban took power, borders have been closed. So although Pakistan says they're not yet seeing a large number of refugees, that's because of the practical problems of actually moving out of Afghanistan.
And of course, there is an increase in the number of Afghan refugees trying to leave the country right now. But for the past 20 years, many people have been trying to leave Afghanistan. I mean, what kind of receptions do they face in countries where they do feel safe, do you think?
That's something that disturbs me greatly, particularly in my own country now, in the UK. There's this operation called Warm Welcome, but there seems to be little attention to the practicalities of it. In addition, the Arab program, which was meant to bring resettle Afghans, and the so-called bespoke program, which hasn't yet been clearly outlined, were very opaque. And so the criteria for entering the country were unclear. That remains a problem going forward. And the question of integration, accommodation, healthcare, a whole raft of other issues, not only in the UK, but in other places in Europe, for example, France, where Macron immediately was concerned about the flood of irregular migrants. Very disturbing in a grave humanitarian crisis where over half the population is in extreme need. There's food insecurity. 1 in 3 people don't know where their next meal is coming from. There's drought, there's climate change, there's a confluence of crises, I would say, to do with the pandemic, to do with poverty, to do with the uptick in violence. So I worked for the Afghanistan Peace and Reintegration Program. I was the advisor to Minister Stanekzai. And one of the things that we found previously in trying to integrate Taliban into local communities was a huge uptick in violence, particularly domestic violence. And that's certainly a concern at the present moment.
It certainly is, Marissa. And I do wonder if you can then give us a sense then as to what this does to a people, to a community, to a culture, when you are so displaced. I mean, as I said, Afghans have been trying to flee their country for many, many years. Not just Afghans, of course, who are fleeing their country. Just give us an idea of what that actually does to a person to be dislocated from your homeland.
Displacement is now at unprecedented levels. The UN has noted that since July, displacement has gone up to, I think it's over 3 million people. The Taliban doesn't have a plan for how to deal with that. They also didn't have a plan in terms of migration because they believed that once the foreign occupation had ended, that presumably problems would cease. But I think many Afghans feel that this government has been imposed upon them rather than something that they wanted. And the question of inclusivity is an important problem going forward. So there is scope, although the hardline government, the hardline interim caretaker government was announced yesterday, and it was all men, and it was all people who were associated with Mullah Omar, including people who had been in Guantanamo and people who have international bounties on their heads. Local people, I think, feel that there's no possibility for them to recognize themselves in the government. And but there is scope for that going forward. So they haven't yet appointed an attorney general. They haven't yet appointed provincial officials. Um, Pakistan is saying just wait and see. This is just interim government, but the signs so far look problematic. I think though that the Taliban has been very surprised by the reaction of the population. So you can see in the footage of the protests, for example, that you were just talking about, that foot soldiers look very, very puzzled that women are standing up to them when they have guns, when they're beating people, when they're filming people, and when there's such intense violence. Huge numbers of people now engage in social media, are involved in using the internet. Unprecedented numbers have been educated. So expectations have changed, and the Ghani government was unable to meet those expectations. The Taliban, when they pivot from being an insurgency to being a governing power, must now confront how are they going to be legitimate for the population, particularly bottom-up acceptance of what they put forward, because existential needs are going to come first, and local communities are going to want to know that they have some kind of stake, as they did in the National Solidarity Program, and in other programs initiated by the government going forward. The long tradition of jirgas and shuras hasn't died. So that recognition is something that the Taliban are going to have to grapple with. This government is ethnically homogeneous, Pashtun. It doesn't recognize religious minorities like Hazara peoples who are Shia. It doesn't recognize women yet. And so those are questions that they will have to face. Of course, they can rely on an illicit economy, but that's going to cause problems with their current allies, Russia, who has a large population of heroin addicts. So relying on the opium economy won't go down well. And also China.
Absolutely. It's a complicated situation and one that we'll be watching very closely. Okay, Marissa Quie from the University of Cambridge, do appreciate your analysis and thank you very much for being with us.